data analytics, communication, change management, strategy, processes, cross-cultural relationships, product management, cost and quality management. I think that's the complete business. Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, he's a senior manager technology with Thomson Reuters. Please give a huge round of applause for Krishna Mohan. Along with him, we also have another gentleman. He has over 15 years of experience, 15 years of rich experience in the field of consulting, technical project management and delivery. He has extensively worked on customizations, extensions, and interface, including B2B and RN, and has experience in managing delivery on implementation, upgrade, rollout, and production support projects. His expertise lies in the areas of analytics, problem solving, troubleshooting, along with hands-on technical and functional knowledge in Oracle, EBS, SCM modules. Ladies and gentlemen, he is the technical supervisor at Arrow Electronics. So, please put your hands together for Nitin Hosurkar.
Thanks a lot for coming. Right after lunch, I know you may have to hurry it up and then finish your lunch just to get in time for this talk. Nitin and I just completed a one-year program in business analytics at Great Lakes. As part of the requirement for the course, we had to complete a capstone project, and this is the one we chose, primarily because we wanted something where we can implement as much of what we learned into the project, and second thing is we wanted to be as lost as possible, and we succeeded in it. So, predictive analytics in legal. So, now, let me give you some background of why we talk about analytics and legal, something which you normally don't associate easily with. It all started in about year 2002. The three people behind me, they, in 2002, noticed that the bench of the Supreme Court, which comprises of 9 justices, had remained unchanged for 7 years between 1995 and 2002. What they realized is that this gives a tremendous amount of data as to how these justices rule in different cases. They thought, why not we use this corpus of data and be able to build some predictive models that can predict whether the Supreme Court is going to confirm the ruling of a lower court, or are they going to reverse the ruling of a lower court? That is how it all started. Eventually, they built models like this, which said, okay, this is what the prediction is going to be. But they had to validate that against the experts in the field of legal. So what they did is they assembled a team of experts, legal experts, from all over the country who understood the Supreme Court and the rulings and the different cases that are ahead in the coming year. They asked these experts to predict each one of those cases. And they compared those cases or those predictions against what their models predicted. What you can see in there is that the model predicted with 75% accuracy, whereas the experts were able to predict only with 56% accuracy. A big, big, big win for analytics in legal. That is something which clinched the fact that analytics has a role in the legal world. So when we were trying to pick a project for our capstone project, this is something that appealed to us. So now we said, okay, what are we going to do next? For those who are not very familiar with the US court system, here is a brief 30-second introduction. Just like in India, the cases that reach the Supreme Court comes through different channels. They can either come through the state Supreme Court or what we consider as the state high courts, or it can come through some of the several federal courts. The one that we thought about concentrating was the US Court of Appeals. For a large number of cases, the Supreme Court takes up only 1% of the cases that come in front of it, as compared to 41% that the Supreme Court of India accepts. So the Court of Appeals becomes the last resort for many, many, many of the cases. So what we did was we looked at what can we do in this particular space. To just give you a little further more introduction as to what this Court of Appeals is all about, the in the United States court system, there are 13 courts of appeals, or as they are popularly known as, the circuit courts. And these are the different geographies that they cover. Amongst those, what we decided is that, okay, let us try to define what our problem statement is, which is primarily to predict what the outcome of these Court of Appeals is going to be. The big difference being that the models that were built by Professor Katz and others was about a binomial outcome. So they used extensively logistic regression and techniques like that. What we had in front of us was that it had 11 different outcomes from the Court of Appeals. Could we build a model that can predict the outcome of the US Supreme or the US Court of Appeals? That is the challenge that was ahead of us. What did we base it on? We thought like, okay, let's look at the basic characteristics of the case. Let's look at the participants, the nature of the case, and then also who the judges were. We thought these are primarily the factors which would eventually influence the outcome of a case. This was our hypothesis. What did it turn out to be true? From here on, we started hunting for data. How we did it, what happened to it, my friend Nitin is going to talk about it for a few minutes.
So next few slides, I'll take you through how we source the data, what kind of data prep we did before we ran the actual model. Okay, so University of South Carolina has gathered the data around the legal domain for 7 years, and they had published it on their website, which was the source for our study. Okay. Along with that, we got a code book. So just the data file was not enough. We had to understand what the underlying data was, what each column was, how do we read that columns. So we had about 90 pages of code book that we downloaded from the South Carolina website just to understand the data. Okay, so these two documents was the basis to start our study. Okay. How did the data look, okay, after we downloaded from the website? So there was a total of 2,160 observations, about 245 columns we had. One of them was the column that we were interested in, the case outcome. 11 possible outcomes. As Krishna was talking, each case or cases had 11 outcomes. The data set was a combination of integers, date fields, categorical, binaries, complex variables. I'll touch upon the complex variables in some moment, what it was and how we dealt with those variables. I'll touch upon it in some time. And majority of them were categorical variables, like very few numerical. Most of them were categorical. And multivariate, like we had different levels of data. It was called like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But we had to refer the code book to find out what those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 were, and then massage the data accordingly before we built the model. Coded factor variables, we had some few variables which were like just one number, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. How do you decode that? How do you decode that and make sense out of that data? So that was one of the exercise that we did again before we ran the model. And missing values, like we had certain missing values on the data set, how we dealt with that. So when we started the project, we thought, okay, we are going to organize our whole study in these following 4 phases. Data prep, where we'll get the data, we'll massage the data, we'll prepare the data for the analysis, then do the data prep, and then run the final model. Okay. So data prep, one thing was, obviously there were a lot of missing values. We just removed those columns. Like certain variables, They're all NAs across all the observations. So we just removed them from the study. And decompose the complex fields. Okay, this is what I was talking about, the complex variables, right? So we have a field which has like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? How do you decode that? So we had to refer back to the code book. Okay, no, the first digit means something. If the first digit is 1, then second digit means something. If the second digit is this, third and fourth means something, right? So we had a huge algorithm we had to write just to decode this number into a meaningful categorical column, which we used for the model. So we used, I think we eventually ended up with 750 combinations that we had to decode finally to get the data prepared. Okay, so there are as many as 12 subcategories. I'll take an example for understanding. Suppose we had something called as an appellant. Like the appellant is the person who's appealing, right? If it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 means he's a person, no? He's like a natural person he's a personal, right? If it is 2 means it's a corporate. If it's 3 means it's a bank. Or if it's 4 means it's a maybe a tax, something like that. Those that we had to read each of them and then decompose the whole data. Okay, so this was one phase, and change the column names. Obviously, by looking at the data set, we didn't understand what these columns were. But to build the model, we needed a proper description to those columns, so we just changed the names as per what we understood, and changed levels from numbers, which I already explained. This graph, which you're seeing here, actually, there were 11 levels that we talked initially, right? 11 outcomes of the case. Those 11 outcomes, if you see the 5 outcomes, 5 case treatments, were actually constituting 88% of the entire data set. Remaining 12% were distributed in the remaining 7 outcomes. So what we did is we reduced the number of levels, the similar case outcomes, we reduced it to 5 levels eventually, or 6 levels. So 11 levels, whatever like a similar case treatments, we reduced that to 5 or 6 outcomes, and then finally we built the model for that. Okay. Again, I told there were 244 columns. We dropped, it became 200 columns. But we thought it would be nice if we can represent the data in certain categories, right? So these were all the columns we had in the data set and how we organized that for our understanding of the data, right? All the, what is the previous code which heard the case, or from which district it was coming, or from which state it was coming. So that constituted the case origin, okay? And who were the participants? Like who was the appellant? And nature of the case, whether it was a criminal or it was a corporate espionage, or it was a tax fraud, or it was immigration. That constituted the nature of the case, and what kind of laws were applied, and who was a judge, whether it was a single judge or a panel of judge. So if there was more than one judge, typically we saw there were 3 judges for each case, so it became a panel of judges. And the outcome, that was the variable that interested us. So what we did is initially before we started the model, we also thought let us run, just for understanding, what are the predictors that are important for the model, right? So we just ran a quick chi-square test for independence. We formulated a null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis. And we just ran a chi-square test, and then, okay, we just analyzed, okay, what are the significant variables and what are the non-significant variables. This was on a level of confidence level of 5%, alpha of 0.05. What we also did is, as a part of dimensionality reduction or feature selection is, there's a package available called as Baruta, actually. I'm not sure how many people have seen this. It's a package in R. Actually, it uses the random forest algorithm to give the list of important predictors. So we ran that model also, and then we just corroborated our chi-square with the Baruta package to find out, okay, what were the significant variables. So all those which are marked in green, the model is saying that, or the package is saying that they are significant variables. And whatever is in red, the model is saying they're not significant. And whatever is in blue, the model says, I cannot decide, you take a decision whether you want to include that in the model or not. So as domain experts, as people who's running the model, it becomes our call whether you want to include that variable or the predictor in the final model or not. Then after we ran this, what we did is we reorganized the entire data. Like we had created various categories. So based on the results from the chi-square test and the Baruta package, we came up with a list of predictors that we're interested in. And we also went through the data set and found out, okay, which might be the other variables, which we feel it's maybe significant. Maybe chi-square test didn't throw that as significant, but still we wanted to include that in the final model. Okay, so we included those variables and came up with these pillars, like again the same case origin, participants, nature of the case, laws applied, and whether it was a single judge or a panel of judges. So we organize the data in this fashion because it becomes more clear for anybody to understand how the entire data set is looking. This actually took almost like 60-65% of our whole project timeline because running the model and tuning the model, that was fairly easy after we did this actually. But here is where we took the maximum number of time to decompose, understand, and since everything was coded as a number, now we have to code that into a categorical variable which we can understand. So this is where we spent most of our time on the data prep and cleansing the data before running the actual model. Okay. So I think I'll hand it over to Krishna from here. He'll take to the model and.
Thank you, Nitin. So now, as you understood, the data was complex. It was not something which was straightforward. It was predominantly categorical. It was something which we were not familiar with. Now, having done all the exercise so far, what is the next thing that we're going to do? We have to figure out which models are we going to apply. So based on all these criteria, the ones that we eventually settled down for were random forest, XGBoost, neural network, and then of course, we want to try out ensemble too. Yes, there is a fascination, like many of us, that we fell into the trap also to say, okay, let's concentrate on the techniques. It happens. And we wanted to try it out, experiment with it. We didn't know which ones are going to work, which ones are not going to work, and how much we would be able to tune the model. But it was definitely an exercise which we wanted to not miss out in this particular project. In the interest of time, I'm going to talk about neural networks and XGBoost. Otherwise, although we did all the 4 models as part of our project. So here are the things that we did. We first ran the model on the entire data set. As you can see, can people in the back see the slides? Is it visible with the fonts? Okay. So as you can see, the accuracy levels were pretty low when you use the entire data set. Then we said, okay, yeah, let's try to trim it, because as we did with the chi-square and the Baruta package, it indicated which ones are the significant variables. And at the same time, when you ran the model, the neural network also says which are the significant variables as well. So based on this, we figured, okay, let's trim the data set to only the significant variables and rerun it. Not much of an improvement. We just moved from 62% to 64%. Now what is the next step that we're going to do? All right, let's say our data set, when we looked at it, the distribution was imbalanced. When you look at all the different, was there a good representation of all the different kinds of combinations in the data that we used once we trimmed the model? We figured, okay, no. Then we went ahead, balanced it with the carrot package. All right, we moved up a little bit, but not enough. Then we looked at the outcome, the distribution of our outcome variable. There was one outcome which was affirmed, which was dominating over all the other outcomes. This was the reason why we thought like the model was not learning what the other outcomes are going to be like. Therefore, we said, okay, why not we do something like oversampling so that there is a good representation of all the different outcomes and run it against our model. That's where the big change happened. You can see that the accuracy moved significantly to 85%. And when we ran it against the test data set, it was at about 82%. So definitely what we understood in the process was that neural networks is one of those we should be focusing on a whole lot more. Similarly, what we did is we looked at the other three packages, which happened to be the XGBoost. Similar exercise. We went through the same kind of steps. We said, okay, yep, run it against the full model. Let's see what it looks like. Eerily, the results were very, very, very similar. But it's just that XGBoost, when we ran it against the balanced and the oversampled data sets, it gave a much higher level of accuracy. We did different combinations of tuning with both neural networks and XGBoost, and this is what we were able to eventually settle down with. Want to show a little more details as to what this, when you look at the confusion matrix of these two models that we used. The one that I want to bring some attention to is if you look at the misclassification as to where it occurred. Right there is that you see that a good number of what the model predicted as affirmed actually happened to be reversed. So that means the model is predicting exactly the opposite of what the actual outcome was. Similarly, vacated is another one where the model thought that it is affirmed, but the actual happened to be vacated. That's something which we observed. When we look at XGBoost and we looked at the misclassification on XGBoost, again, they were very, very similar. You can see that right here, about 42 and 96 of them were misclassified, which should have been reversed. 96 should have been reversed, but the model thought they were affirmed. Now, what it's telling us is that there probably are just a few variables which are tilting the balance in there, or which is causing this misclassification to a point that you're getting a result which is exactly the opposite of this. Now, this is where we are focusing a whole lot more at this moment, like this misclassification. And what we are trying to do as one of some of the steps ahead is that try to boil this down to like a E equals MC squared kind of a formula, where you can very much simplify and then say, okay, if you can understand 2 or 3 different variables really well, you can predict what the outcome of the US Court of Appeals is going to be. That is something which we are working, and hopefully we'll have some breakthrough in the coming days. Now, the lessons that we learned from all these exercises is that when you use a classification model, it is very, very important that you have good representation of all the possible outcomes. That is where the oversampling helped us in getting that balance. But there's definitely always a trade-off when you do this, something like this. Because when you're trying to interpret this and then tie it back to what exactly is happening within the model, it becomes much more difficult. When you have just the data that you received it in the first place, you can figure out, okay, what happened in there. But when you have oversampling where data is being simulated, interpretation of the outcome becomes a lot more difficult. So that is the trade-off. So this is something important that we understood in the process. The other thing is that there was a pattern in the most significant variables across all the different models that we used. Some of those were like, what matters is that the circuit code, we had 13 circuit codes which we started off with. Which circuit code is dealing with the case is a significant variable. So it can be interpreted that if you take a case to one circuit court, your chances of winning the appeal could be different where if you take it to a different court of appeals. This comes into play especially in interstate disputes. Like for example, the whole Kaveri dispute, if it had gone to a circuit court and if one party had decided to appeal, they could this kind of information will help them figure out which circuit court is more likely to give me a ruling in my favor. The other ones are like, what was the verdict of the previous court? If it happened to be not ascertained, mainly because the jurisdiction might be an issue, the laws applied might have been an issue for several different reasons, the lower court would have said, okay, I don't know what to do with this, I will leave it at that. If that was the outcome of the lower court, the chances of you winning the appeal in the circuit court is much higher. Nature of the appellant. There are different kinds of appellants, as Nitin mentioned. So if the person happens to be a natural person, not a company or a different organization, who happens to have come under some issue which is related to the First Amendment, which primarily deals with a right of a person to protest or to have the liberty to speech, then this Court of Appeals is more likely to take up the case and give a ruling in your favor. And finally, who was the initiator? Whether it was the plaintiff or it was another party or the person who actually lost the case in the previous court. All of these are very significant factors which helps the different parties figure out whether they want to use this, go to the Court of Appeals or not. So overall, what we see is that in India's context, how does this help? Right now, there are like about 3 crore cases sitting in the legal system in India. There are billions of documents on tens of billions of papers which are in the court system. So data analytics can play a role in helping all of these. The reluctance of the legal fraternity to adopt to changes, or especially technology, is something that is going to be a challenge in Indian context. And away from that is that if you just simply use an 80-20 rule, by using data analytics, you may be able to resolve 80% of the cases using 20% of other cases as your reference. You can also look to say the 80% of the cases actually are identical. So they're probably consuming, and only 20% of the cases are probably consuming 80% of the court's resources, which doesn't make sense, and which is the reason why we have such a huge backlog of cases. By being able to cluster them or being able to classify them into certain categories, and also giving information to the parties to say, okay, what is your chance of winning or losing a particular case, the court system can definitely be much more optimized. So when you look at the Indian legal system and the quick 30-minute flavor of how data analytics can come into this, you see that there's a huge challenge, and data analytics, can it find a bigger challenge anywhere else? So you as the data analytics fraternity, are you ready to help? Thank you. So how much time do we have?
We still have 5 minutes.
4 minutes, okay. Any questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a suggestion as well as a question.
Mm-hmm.
Suggestion is, when your chi-square is not giving the key KPIs or key variable for your equation, it is not because of the variable. It is because of the type of data which you align in your equation. So either you need to change your type, or you can restructure your data in a way where system can align and get a better score to get it in align with your equation. And the question is, if this is the situation which you already said, what is the solution
Solution to
to Indian environment?
Indian environment. So first question with regard to the chi-square. Yeah, we had a predominantly categorical data. And chi-square was just a reference point for us. And then when we looked at the significant variables from all the different models that were built, we compared those and then saw how much of them happened to be in common. So there was a validation of chi-square was just a starting point for us. And similarly, that's the reason why we used the Baruta package and everything else as well. So eventually,